Howdy, everybody. Dr. Andy Woods here. I'm the pastor teacher at Sugarland Bible Church. Welcome to Pastor's Point of View number 360. This is being released on June the 27th, 2025. We want to bring to you today a prophecy update. I have to be honest with you, these prophecy updates are getting more and more difficult to put together, although I'm going to try to continue to do my best for you each week. And the reason they're difficult is world events related to prophecy are just moving at such an exponential speed. It's just hard to cover everything, in a comprehensive manner. But we're going to make that attempt today nonetheless. You'll notice our preview slide. We've got 3 things we're going to look at. I want to say a few things about the work of the restrainer, a few things about anti-Semitism, but I'd like to spend the most of our time there on number 3, the GOG-MAGOG alignment. And the reason for that is we are recording this on June the 17th. And so we are in the wake of the whole Israeli strike against Iran's nuclear capabilities and Iran's counter strike against the nation of Israel. And people are wondering what is going on with that and how does that fit into the prophetic scenario. We've got a lot to say about that, obviously. But before we get to that, let's go ahead and start with our first bullet point of 3, the restrainer. The reason I like to talk about the restrainer is very few people in prophecy circles on their updates mention this, but it's part of Bible prophecy because when Paul talks about prophetic subjects, and he does one of his most detailed descriptions of prophetic subjects in 2 Thessalonians 2, he says one of the things that's preventing that whole scenario, including the man of lawlessness, from coming forward is the work of the restrainer. I believe that the work of the restrainer is the work that he does primarily through the church, but others as well, to hold back the spirit of Antichrist in our age. Notice what 2 Thessalonians 2, 6 and 7 says. It says, you know what restrains him so that in his time, that's the Antichrist, he will be revealed, for the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. So there's a spirit of lawlessness in the world, but before the man of lawlessness can come, the restrainer is at work holding him at bay. In other words, we see the prophetic stage developing today, but we're not yet in the time period of prophetic realization and fulfillment directly. And that time won't happen until the restrainer is removed, which is, you guys know from me, and I've defended this in other shows, is the rapture of the church. So the Holy Spirit uses people, he uses Christians to hold back the Antichrist today. And he uses people in government. In fact, that's the purpose of government, is to restrain evil. Notice Romans 13, verses 3 through 5. It says, for rulers are not a cause for fear, for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Then do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it, or government, is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid. For it, government, does not bear the sword for nothing, for it, or government, is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. So God can use government, and he can use people in government to disrupt pose an obstacle, we might put it that way, the work of the Antichrist and the very advent of the Antichrist. And I believe that that is how God is currently using the Trump administration. I don't think it's a perfect administration. I don't think Trump is a perfect person. There are no perfect people other than the God-man, Jesus Christ. But everything I've seen since his inauguration, January 20th of this year, He has been used very, very significantly to obstruct the New World Order or the coming globalism of the Antichrist. And I like to make people aware of some of these things that he is doing. Notice this particular article here. It says Trump issues a travel ban for a dozen countries over terrorism concerns. Now, this is in addition to the shutting down of the border that he did within a few hours. People say it took days. It didn't take days. It took a few hours, something the Biden administration claimed it couldn't do, left the border wide open, unvetted people, millions of people. We have no idea why they're here, who they are, what their motives are, came into the country illegally, and Trump, upon taking office January 20th, within just a few hours, shut off, closed down this porous borders policy of the Biden years. And Trump is continuing to move in the same direction. And this is an article from conservativebrief.com, June 5th, 2025. It says President Donald Trump has signed a sweeping order blocking travel to the U.S. from nearly 20 countries identified as high risk for terrorism via abuse and a failure to share security information. The new travel restrictions announced under Executive Order 14161 apply to nationals from 12 countries, including Afghanistan, Iran, that's now in the news. And I believe Jimmy Carter, if I got my history right, issued a similar travel ban against Iran at the height of the Iranian hostage crisis back in the late 1970s. So if people don't like this, then they've got to take aim at one of the most progressive liberal presidents we've ever had, Jimmy Carter. Iran, Somalia, Libya, Yemen, all deemed very high risk due to terrorist activity, weaker hostile governments, and high visa overstay rates. Citizens from another 7 countries, including Venezuela, Cuba, Laos, are under partial restrictions, Fox News reported. And of course, we might even add other countries to the list. I think if I heard right on the news, this is just sort of the beginning of a very common sense, intelligent policy that the Trump administration is putting into place. He's making decisions as a nationalist, not as a one worlder, not as a globalist, not as someone who's trying to, merge Canada, Mexico, and the United States under some kind of region, as we saw from the George Bush Jr. Administration, but he's making decisions as a nationalist, doing what's right for America, putting America first, make America great again. I see that as restraining the spirit or the presence or the force of the New World Order. An Antichrist type president would never do something like this. He'd be all about merging the planet together. Here's some more work related to the restrainer. This article comes from cbn.com, June 4th, 2025. The title of it is Trump Administration Declares June is No Longer Pride Month. Retail stores backtrack on LGBT displays. It's kind of interesting that when Trump makes a move like this, the retailers and other outlets take notice and they start to follow his pattern. I might call that, or that has been called, the Trump effect. Here is what the article says. The White House has officially declared that June will no longer be the LGBT Pride Month. This comes as GOP leaders in Congress head in the same direction and more companies back away from pushing rainbow flags and other LGBT themed items in retail stores. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told reporters Tuesday that the White House has no plans to issue a proclamation recognizing June as Pride Month. There are no plans for a proclamation for the month of June, Leavitt said, but I can tell you this president is proud to be the president of all Americans, regardless of race, religion, or creed. What is she saying there? We're going to protect traditional civil rights categories, but these behaviors, we're not going to turn these people into some kind of group like being Asian, Black, Hispanic that deserve civil rights protection. And where did all of this, turning June into this Pride Month, where did it start? Well, the article says in 1990, former President Bill Clinton named June Gay and Lesbian Month. A decade later, then President Barack Obama expanded it to include bisexual and transgender people and named it LGBT Pride Month. In 2021, Biden, these are all Democrat presidents, Clinton, Obama, Biden. The Biden administration further expanded the observance to include queers, dubbing the observance LGBTQ plus Pride Month. Trump just issues an executive order, and he says no. To my mind, this is huge. It's a big deal. It's so far removed, 180 degrees from what was going on in the Biden years when the rainbow flag flew, you might remember, in all of our embassies for Pride Month and other occasions for that matter. And here you have Trump via an executive order doing a 180 and sending things the opposite direction. That is, folks, the work of the restrainer through Trump doing these things. Here is another very positive development. This one comes from the Conservative Brief. This is again a June 5th, 2025 article. It says Pete Hegseth orders Navy to rename a ship dedicated to a gay rights advocate. Here's what the article says. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has directed the Navy to take the unusual step of renaming a ship currently named after a prominent gay rights figure, according to documents and sources. Military.com reviewed a memorandum from the Office of the Secretary of the Navy, which has the authority to name naval vessels, detailing plans to roll out the renaming of the oiler ship USNS Harvey Milk. A defense official confirmed that the Navy is preparing to remove the ship's current name, noting that Navy Secretary John Phelan was directed to take action by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Now, who is this Harvey Milk that this ship is named after, that Hegseth now is taking that name away from that ship? Well, Harvey Milk is a guy who was homosexual. He was a gay rights advocate in the city of San Francisco, brought all of this LGBTQ mindset into San Francisco as one of the leaders of that movement. Now, tragically, and obviously we don't support this, violence is wrong, murder is wrong, but he was gunned down in cold blood by one of his political enemies, political opponents, a man named Dan White. And there was a big hubbub that went on in the late 70s, I think it was, because of all of this. Dan White's attorneys, if I remember right, used the Twinkie defense, trying to argue that there was too much sugar in his head or something, therefore he wasn't responsible for his actions. But we all know he was responsible for his actions. But at any rate, this horrific thing that happened in San Francisco took this man, Harvey Milk, a homosexual practitioner, an activist, and almost, well, not almost, it promoted him to almost the level of a civil rights leader like Martin Luther King Jr. And I don't think he is a civil rights leader, because the civil rights movement was about protecting people from discrimination based on an immutable characteristic about themselves that they can't control, such as gender, skin color, race, creed, religion, national origin, those kind of things. And what Harvey Milk did is he opened the door to behavior, homosexuality, as some kind of equivalent of a civil rights suspect category. And of course, the homosexual activists followed suit, and they made this man a hero. They named, streets after him, buildings after him, ships after him. And here's Pete Hegseth saying, no more, no more of this. I mean, this man doesn't deserve, a ship named after him. What he's advocating is a moral perversion, and he, does not deserve this heroic status, even though the man was killed or murdered by Dan White. So this is another example of something very, very positive that is happening in the Trump administration. The reason I bring these things to your attention is because when you read the book, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, I think the author's name is Gibbon, Edward Gibbon. And you read what he says in there. I think he wrote that. He's considered a first-rate historian. He wrote that around the time of our American Revolution. He talks about how Rome started to disintegrate internally and morally long before it fell politically. And one of the things that he talks about in that particular book is how homosexuality was normalized in that society and that culture. And so I believe that as homosexuality becomes kind of the norm in the United States of America, if history is any barometer, that's our fate as well. I mean, we will start to collapse internally first, long before we collapse politically. And as far as the issue of homosexuality is concerned, I mean, my basic belief on it from a political angle, obviously biblically, I think it's wrong. I think it's a sinful behavior. It's not like being black or being Asian or Hispanic. Paul in 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 through 11 of homosexuals says, such as some of you were. In other words, a homosexual, just like an adulterer or a thief or a murderer or anybody else, can change their behavior. The leopard can change his spots in that sense, but being black, Asian, Hispanic, Caucasian, whatever, you can't change. So what Harvey Milk was doing was he was pushing behavior as part of the civil rights agenda, I think illegitimately. But my belief related to homosexuality is I don't want to illegalize homosexuality. Do what you want to do. But at the same time, I don't want to use public money to promote homosexuality. Let's, this idea, let's teach it in the schools. Let's rename ships and streets after famous homosexual activists. I think that's equally wrong. So my position on it is basically a position of neutrality. Don't suppress it. Don't illegalize it. By the way, it was illegal. If you go back to the dawn of the United States of America, the original 13 colonies all had on their books anti-homosexual legislation, taking that cue from Blackstone's legal commentaries on the law, and they called homosexuality a crime against nature. So Blackstone's commentaries on the law came from the perspective that we don't rule against what the Creator is in favor of, and what the Creator is against, we don't rule in favor of that. And so homosexuality is condemned in the Bible, Romans chapter 1, other places. It's condemned in general revelation because you look at even the animal kingdom, same-sex couples cannot reproduce. So God has not designed a world advocating and promoting homosexuality. And so Blackstone's commentaries made it illegal. Now, my position is it shouldn't be illegal and it shouldn't be promoted. It's a position of neutrality. But as you rename June Pride Month and you rename ships and all of these things that people are doing, you're moving in the direction not of neutrality but of promotion. And it's just thrilling to see the Trump administration, Pete Hegseth, etc., doing a U-turn in this direction, taking a huge cue, whether they realize it or not, from the famous book by Edward Gibbon, I think it is, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. This is the work of the restrainer. There's other things that the Trump administration is doing. Notice this from the Geller report. It says cutting ties with Harvard. The Trump administration is to sever remaining contracts with the formerly elite university. This is May the 30th, 2025, and it says this: the Trump administration is set to cancel the federal government's remaining federal contracts with Harvard University worth an estimated $100 million, according to a letter sent to federal agencies on Tuesday. The letter also instructs agencies to find alternative vendors for future services. The additional planned cuts outlined in a draft of the letter obtained by the New York Times represented what an administration official called a complete severance of the government's long-standing business relationship with Harvard. I am somewhat at a loss as to why we, at the governmental level, are continuing to fund Harvard. Do you realize that Harvard, the last time I heard someone talk about this, has an endowment of $52 billion? I mean, my goodness, that's probably bigger than most countries, I would think, around the world, little countries around the world. That's a huge, huge endowment. Why does Harvard continue to need our tax money, particularly when you look at the behavior of Harvard? I mean, what's come to the surface recently is Harvard is anti-Semitic to the core. I mean, Jewish students are afraid to go to class. Professors routinely, make statements in class against the nation of Israel. Why does a school like that deserve federal money? And beyond that, look at the fall of Harvard. Do you realize that Harvard was once the light of early America? That's where all of our early clergy that preached the gospel all over the United States of America and founded churches, that's where they were originally trained. I think I heard that Harvard, for its first either 100 or 200 years, did not, and you might want to double check my numbers on that, but it's a pretty staggering number, did not even have a person on faculty that was not a member of the clergy. And look at what has happened to Harvard. Look at how it has fallen and gone the exact opposite direction of Scripture. And, they've got a $52 billion endowment. If you want to be pagan and wicked and anti-Semitic, why don't you just go ahead and do that on your own dime? I have no understanding why we keep pouring more and more federal taxpayer money into that school. But, here is the Trump administration yet again through an executive order or orders cutting the ties with Harvard. This is the work of the restrainer. Speaking of anti-Semitism, look at this one. This one comes from Breitbart.com, June the 10th, 2025. It involves Mike Huckabee, a former Baptist minister. I think he has a seminary degree, and he's a strong Christian. And notice what this headline says. It says, U.S. Ambassador in the Trump administration, that is, Mike Huckabee. What does he say? The Palestinian state could be built in a Muslim country, not inside Israeli-controlled lands. What is he talking about, this Palestinian state? Well, we've got a map or two on the subject. This is called the West Bank, flippantly, and I say flippantly because that's not a biblical designation, but it's west of the Jordan, as you can see here, so it gets this name West Bank, and basically that's territory that the nation of Israel won in a war of self-defense in 1967, and the world community wants to take that away and give it to the so-called Palestinians. If you take a look at the next map, this map I like better because it names that territory what the Bible calls it, Judea and Samaria. And you notice what that would do to Israel if that were relinquished to the so-called Palestinians. It would take Israel's width, reduce it to its 19 pre-1967, post-1948 borders, reduce its width by less than 10 miles, putting them in a militarily indefensible position. Notice that little tiny brown strip called Gaza in the southwestern portion of the map. What is that? That's a two-state solution also. That's an area that in 2004 the Israelis gave back to the so-called Palestinians, inhabitants of Gaza. And in 2005 they had one and only one election there. They elected Hamas. And ever since that point in time, that little brown strip has been used as a beachhead for one terrorist incursion after another into the land of Israel, culminating in the horrific events of October the 7th, 2023, something that could have been completely and totally avoided had the Israelis not given up the Gaza Strip. So if the Gaza Strip didn't work so well, if the two-state solution didn't work so well in Gaza, how would it ever work with Judea and Samaria or the so-called West Bank? And yet that's what the world community is demanding constantly, that Israel give up the so-called West Bank, Judea, and Samaria. And along comes Mike Huckabee, a Christian that says, hey, if you want a Palestinian state, why don't you build it in a Muslim country? You know where the Palestinian state was originally supposed to be? It was supposed to be in Jordan. If you go back to, the San Remo Accords post-World War I, 1947 partition post-World War II, that's where it was supposed to be. But somehow people have said, you know what? There's only one way to beat the Israelis. We've got to put them into a militarily defenseless position, and let's do that by arguing for this so-called Palestinian state within their own borders. And here comes Mike Huckabee saying, build the Palestinian state somewhere else. Why don't you build it in a Muslim country? Why don't you build it in Jordan, where it was originally supposed to be? Why don't you build it in France? Macron is so interested in a two-state solution. Let's have a Palestinian state in France. And so this is so refreshing to see a right-thinking, Bible-based Christian ascend to the highest levels of the Trump administration, stating the obvious. The king is naked. And I think this is going to bless our country overall, because God made a promise to the Jewish people, the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in Genesis 12 and verse 3. We can put that scripture up. God made this promise, I will bless those. He said this to the patriarch Abram as he was being called from the Ur of the Chaldeans and told to walk by faith. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. I don't know about y'all, but I want to be on the blessing side of that, not the cursing side. And perpetually arguing we want to carve up Israel's land puts us on the cursing side, and Huckabee is putting us on the blessing side. And for that, I praise the Lord. So this is obvious work that the Holy Spirit is doing via the Trump administration by way of restraint. Now, it's not all a bed of roses, because there's a lot of ugly things going on in our world too that are setting the stage for the end times prophetic scenario. So let's go to our second category. It has to do with anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, as you know, is the irrational hatred of the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And if I'm understanding my Bible correctly, that kind of thing, that kind of philosophy will grow, not decrease, but increase as we get closer and closer to the end times. We use this picture on the screen there frequently. This is depicting Revelation 12, where the devil, midway through the tribulation period, will be cast out of heaven, and he will try to gobble up the woman clothed with the sun and the moon and the 12 stars, so that the kingdom cannot come to the earth through her. Of course, Satan hates the kingdom, the millennial kingdom, because once the millennial kingdom comes, he'll be bound for 1,000 years, and he doesn't want to give up, his illegitimate authority over planet Earth that he has wielded ever since the fall of man in Genesis 3. So he works in history to blot out Israel, and that spiritual warfare is going to intensify to a fever pitch in the second half of the tribulation period. So don't look for anti-Semitism to decrease as we get closer to the second coming of Christ. Look for it to increase. And of course, there are many things going on in the news that show you that this anti-Semitism is alive and well. Notice this article from the Jewish News. Let's see, is that Syndicate or Service? One of the two. And the title of it is Arizona Governor Vetoes a Bill to Hold Teachers Liable for Jew Hatred in Schools. Governor Hobbs, the current governor of Arizona, the article says, is frighteningly wrong. Morton Klein, national president of the ZOA, Jewish Advocacy Group, Zionist group, told JNS, this is dated June 11th, 2025. Real quickly here, it says Arizona Governor Katie Hobbs, a Democrat, vetoed legislation on Tuesday that would have allowed public school students and their families to sue teachers over anti-Semitic content in their instruction. Under the provisions of HB 2867, Arizona would have adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of Jew hatred and forbidden education officials from propagating any anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic conduct or act or process that constitutes harassment and discrimination that creates a hostile educational environment against Jewish families, Jewish students, etc. And the article goes on, and it just, Katie Hobbs and the educational establishment just give one excuse after another why they couldn't sign the law. It's going to hurt education. It's going to hurt teachers. It's going to stop free speech. But the article goes on to say, you know what, if the shoe were on the other foot, and this was legislation preventing hatred against homosexuals or some other politically correct group, the LGBTQ crowd or Islam or Muslims or whatever, she would have signed it in a heartbeat. But she didn't sign this because she's biased against the Jewish people. Why is she biased against the Jewish people? Because that's what God said would happen amongst political leaders in the last days. On this subject of anti-Semitism, notice this particular article from the Daily Wire, June 5th, 2025. It says Christian pro-Israel conference is canceled after an overwhelming number of credible terror threats. A pro-Israel conference hosted by Christians was forced to cancel at the last minute after credible terror threats were directed towards the venue in Texas, conservative Texas of all places. The Israel Summit, organized by the pro-Israel, a pro-Israel nonprofit, and it mentions who the nonprofit is, and the Israel Guys podcast that was involved in organizing the event was expected to draw more than 1,000 attendees June 9th to 11th. The event was originally scheduled to take place in Dallas, but organizers switched venues due to heightened threat levels and an overwhelming security burden estimated in the hundreds and thousands of dollars. The new venue outside Dallas had initially agreed to host the event and to implement necessary security protocol, but backed out after facing direct and indirect threats from American pro-Hamas and jihadist groups that called for targeting the private conference, according to organizers who were reportedly working with the Sheriff's Department, Texas State Rangers, and the FBI. Now, the summit's organizers are questioning whether it is even possible to safely host pro-Israel events in the United States. Boy, may God help us, where you can't even have a public event promoting Zionism, promoting the Israeli side of things, without being threatened to the point where you have to, close your doors. But that's something else that happened recently, and it's just another example of the anti-Semitism of our times. And then here enters the picture Piers Morgan. This article comes from the Geller Report. It says, "Watch," and there's a video here. It goes about 4 minutes. We don't have it for you to play, but you can go to this article and watch it, and it shows you in real time what Piers Morgan did here. Pamela Geller with this title, and this is dated June 6, 2025. "Watch, Israel advocate and lawyer is repeatedly interrupted and contested by Piers Morgan in a one-sided debate." Now, how many times was this attorney interrupted? The article says the pathetic bully, that would be Piers Morgan, cut her off 60 times. So the article says Piers Morgan is a Jew hater. Many Americans remember Piers Morgan for his unhinged rants about the Second Amendment while working at CNN. And I remember those days when he would just rail against the Second Amendment, and I would say to myself, "Piers, why don't you go back to the UK if you're so upset with our American Second Amendment? Why are you always interjecting yourself into the affairs of another country?" Morgan hosts Piers Morgan's Uncensored in the UK, on which he will often debate the Israel-Hamas war issues. Morgan routinely bullies, abuses, insults his pro-Israel guests with lies and slanders, all while he handles pro-Hamas guests with kids' gloves. The mainstream media's vilification of Israel is one of the main reasons our streets have become unsafe for Jews. Piers Morgan, along with anti-Israel Dave Smith, apparently a comedian, I've never heard of him, ganged up on an international law expert and proud Israel defender, Natasha, and I'm going to try hard to pronounce her name, Hausdorff, refusing to let her get a single word in defense of Israel and its war in the Gaza Strip. Now, you can go online, you can go to YouTube, for example, and you could Google this international attorney. I don't think she lives in Israel, but I think she's Jewish. And boy, you'd want to talk about someone who knows her stuff? It's her. I mean, she comes with facts, figures. She can dispute when these leftists are, relying upon Hamas statistics and the Hamas narrative. And here Piers Morgan brings her on and doesn't even let her talk. And you could watch this 4-minute clip, and it's got all 60 times that he interrupts her. And in fact, a lot of times as he's interrupting her, he's using profanity. He says basically the whole episode is Morgan yelling over Hausdorff, and I'm not going to use the words he was saying because this is family viewing, but BS, BS, BS. And then the article says graceless, classless thug, the antithesis of a civilized, rational engagement that we see from both Hausdorff and her colleague, Douglas Murray. I mean, who is this Piers Morgan? I mean, Piers Morgan is an activist masquerading as a journalist. And he doesn't act like a professional journalist when you watch this exchange. And it's one thing to disagree with a guest, To let a guest say their piece and then try to refute it with your own arguments. But Piers Morgan doesn't even do that. He doesn't even let her make her points. And I've never liked bullies. I particularly don't like people that beat up girls. And that's what Piers Morgan is doing here with someone who is extremely well studied, extremely credible in the field. He's not even going to let her talk. And I watched her on social media on X following this, basically saying Piers Morgan wouldn't even let me speak. He wouldn't even hear the arguments. And so this is the kind of nonsense that Zionists and pro-Israel types put up with regularly. I mean, he would never treat a Muslim this way or someone taking the Hamas side of the ledger this way. He might disagree with them, but he's not going to shut them down, and that's what he did on this particular show. And I think Piers Morgan is repulsive. I think he's disgusting. As I said before, I do not look at him as a real journalist. I look at him as an activist masquerading as a journalist. In fact, the longer I talk about this, the higher my blood pressure gets. So I'm gonna try to change subjects in as quickly as I can. But watch those videos embedded in that article because it shows you how differently he treats advocates for Hamas, etc. He lets them finish their sentences. He lets them speak. He doesn't do that with erudite, intelligent Jewish women that are trained attorneys and advocates and know the issues backwards and forwards. Speaking of anti-Semitism, here is another example of it. This particular article comes from the National Review, June 2nd, 2025. The article says there's no evidence IDF attacked a Gaza aid center. Yet, U.S. media ran with the Hamas claim anyway. I mean, this is an astounding story of this supposed IDF attack on a Gaza aid center. Well, the truth of the matter is it didn't happen. The article quotes people proving that and demonstrating it. But why let facts interfere with the narrative? The rest of the left-wing media, the mainstream media, the lamestream media, as sometimes it's called, took the story and ran with it. And it's just another example of anti-Semitism in our day. These kinds of things coming from ABC, CBS, CNN, the New York Times, etc., aren't going to get any better. I think these things are actually going to get worse, where they're more interested in promoting a narrative that's anti-Israeli than they are at reporting truth. And while they're promoting fake stories, they ignore the real stories. Look at this one from Breitbart, June 11th, 2025. And tell me if you heard of this in any mainstream media outlet. It says Hamas attacks a bus of workers from American Aid, their group in Gaza, and there's been 5 deaths and possible hostages. Now I read that and I say, whoa, no one's talked about that one other than a few sources like Breitbart, etc. Why is a story like this buried, but a fake story is given life? Well, it just shows you the two-sided nature of journalism, so-called. I put that word in very loose quotes, that the Israelis are now subjected to. Routine propaganda against Israel around the clock. So let's move from anti-Semitism to our last category, and this has to do with the GOG-MAGOG alignment. Here we have a map that we like to put up, and you'll notice that it has Russia and Iran circled. And the reason they're circled with an arrow from them towards the nation of Israel is they are 2 of the prophesied or predicted players in the last days, where Russia and Iran will team up and they will invade Israel in the last days. And so the question is, how does the recent Israeli strike against Iran, how does it fit into this scenario? And I don't believe we're in the age of prophetic fulfillment, but I believe the stage is being set for this invasion because God can't lie. This was a prophecy given 2,600 years ago. And I believe the stage is being set like a chessboard. The chessboard is being set up for the final match or the final game. And that's what's happening in our news feeds. And the Israeli strike against Iran and Iran's reaction to it is no exception to the rule. If you're struggling with why does Persia equal Iran, why does Rosh equal Russia, I don't have time in a limited broadcast like this to give you all the proof. To help you with that, I recommend my book, The Middle East Meltdown, The Coming Islamic Invasion of Israel, that will give you all the documentation. But you'll notice our map here, once again, we've got Persia or Iran circled and Israel circled. The reason those two nations are circled is Persia or Iran will invade Israel in the last days, according to Ezekiel 38 and 39. And if all of this is true, and if we are in the general season of the Lord's return, which I believe we are, then we ought to see tension developing, shouldn't we, between Iran and the nation of Israel. And that's exactly what we see manifesting itself all of the time. Notice this particular screenshot here. This one comes from OSIN Defender. And it says this: according to CBS News, U.S. officials have been told Israel is now fully ready to launch an operation into Iran, with this being a primary reason for the announced evacuation of the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad and General Consulate in Erbil, as well as the departure of military dependents from the Middle East. U.S. officials are concerned that Iran could launch attacks against U.S. bases and assets in the region in response to a strike against its nuclear facilities by Israel. Now, you notice this is dated June 11th. Well, this is being recorded on June 17th, and we know what happened on June 13th, right? This strike by Israel did occur. And Iran, in the meantime, has been doing counter strikes against Israel in retaliation. So the very tension that Ezekiel said that would exist in the last days between Israel and Iran is happening before our eyes. The tension is stage setting for the coming invasion of Iran into Israel. With all of that being said, notice this one here from the, Current Report 1. It says, just in, Iranian military officials have concluded a high-level meeting. Tehran has developed a response plan that includes an immediate counterattack on Israel with hundreds of ballistic missiles, according to the New York Times. So once again, what was predicted here, June 11th, is now happening post June 13th. Notice this particular screenshot here from, I think you pronounce that, Ayal Yacobi. And it says the Iranian Ayatollah Ali Khamenei during his speech addressing nuclear talks, quote, Trump is lying, and his statements are not worth a response. Death to America, death to England, death to Israel, death to infidels, close quote. As you know, in the minds of the Iranian regime, and I'm not condemning here the Persian people are a beautiful people, and if the truth were known, and I've understood that Wi-Fi and internet access has been cut off in some areas of Iran to prevent this little piece of information from coming to the surface. But if the truth were known, no one would be more on the side of the Israelis than the Persian people who have been subjected by a diabolical regime since Jimmy Carter's bungling of the whole situation, back in 1979. Keep in mind, Daniel chapter 10 talks about a demon over Persia in the last days. I mean, that may explain why Persia has shifted in recent days from being an ally of Israel, an ally of the West. I mean, you go back into the Bible times and you see how it was the Persians that allowed Israel to return after the 70-year Babylonian captivity under a man named Cyrus. So the Persians have always been pro-Jewish, pro-Israel. Now that shifted in the days of Haman, in the book of Esther, etc. But it's interesting that Persia has a paper trail going right into modern times. In pre-1979, Persia was an ally of Israel. In fact, they were among the first to recognize the reborn state of Israel. And they were an ally of the West. But everything shifted in the days of Jimmy Carter with the deposing of the Shah and replacing the Shah with the Ayatollah. And ever since then, Iran became known as the Islamic Republic of Iran, a Shiite Islamic theocracy. And the shift, I believe, happened largely because of the demon or the fallen angel over Persia that will have a role in the last days, and I'm getting that from Daniel chapter 10. But my point in bringing all of this to your attention is there's tension developing between Israel and Persia or Iran, which is setting the stage for this invasion yet to come, predicted in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. So with all of that being said, notice this particular article from the Jerusalem Post. It says, Israel is considering striking Iran in coming days without U.S. support, a report said. Additionally, on Wednesday, the U.S. authorized the evacuation of certain personnel in Iraq in anticipation of a potential Israel strike on Iran. Now, that's yesterday's news, right? That's dated June 12th, because one day later, the Israelis did their strike against Iran. And I want to read to you, if I could, a little something from the James Dobson Facebook page. We're under GOG-MAGOG, and I'm reading something. We don't have a screenshot on this, I don't think, but this comes from the James Dobson Family Institute, and he is reacting to the Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear capabilities. And he summarized things so well. I just want to quote his words here. This is very brief. It says, the James Dobson Family Institute strongly supports the nation of Israel and its people at this critical moment. Contrary to press reports, Israel did not launch an unprovoked attack on Iran. It launched a preemptive precision, notice that language, precision strike to deter Iran. Now, I put in brackets a Shiite Islamic theocracy, continuing with Dobson's quote, to deter Iran from its nearly complete goal of becoming a nuclear power. We hope and pray that Israel will be successful and Iran will abandon its nuclear weapons program and choose a peaceful future for its people. Please join us in praying for the peace of Jerusalem. Now, notice what Dobson brings up here. Israel did not do some kind of unprovoked carte blanche attack against Iran. It was a precision strike. It was a strike that was designed to take out Israel's key bomb makers as they're inching towards a nuclear weapon, figuring out when they were going to have their meeting, when they were all going to be in the same place at the same time. And it took out key scientists that are assisting or building this nuclear weapon. And it took out some of, not all, but some of Iran's nuclear facilities. So it was not some kind of carte blanche strike. It was a precision strike. It wasn't aimed at innocent civilians. Why did Israel do that? Well, one of the reasons is because Iran is a Shiite Islamic theocracy where they chant over and over again destruction to the little Satan, Israel, and then guess what, folks? To the greater Satan, the great Satan, the United States of America. I mean, Israel, by doing this, did us in the West a huge favor. They fixed a problem that includes us. Because once in the Iranian regime's mind, once they're finished with Israel, they're going to turn their attention towards the West. And what do I mean by a Shiite Islamic theocracy? It's different than a Sunni Islamic theocracy like Saudi Arabia. A Shiite Islamic theocracy is basically the belief that the Iranian regime believes that they can cause the 12th Imam to come to the earth in the midst of chaos and confusion that they themselves are causing. Now, how in the world do you let a Islamic Nazi anti-Semitic regime like that, who, by the way, is the #1 state sponsor of terror, who, by the way, 2 times, not once, 2 times last year, launched multiple ballistic missiles from Iran into the nation of Israel. By the way, one of these bomb makers, scientists that was killed, it's my understanding that what he wanted on his tombstone is he wanted it to be known that he had somehow played a role in the destruction of the occupying Zionist state, the nation of Israel. How do you let people like this get their hands on nukes? I mean, the world community was just sitting there and twiddling its thumbs, trying to get them to agree to all these deals, the Obama nuclear deal, etc., not understanding that in Islam, there's something called taqiyya, where you are allowed to lie to advance the causes of Allah and Islam. How in the world do you think people like that are going to hold to any agreement that the West comes up with? You know, it's like Neville Chamberlain believing that Adolf Hitler was going to agree to an agreement, and Chamberlain went back to his people and said, "Peace in our times." And yet the ink on the agreement was hardly dry before Hitler broke the agreement. I mean, that's the same kind of thing that happens with this taqiyya in Islam. How do you let people like this get their hands on nukes? And the Israelis, as a sovereign country, said, you know what? We're not going to allow it to happen. We've had enough talk. We've had enough negotiations. They're within probably, I don't know, some would say just a month, maybe less, maybe weeks away from getting their hands on nukes. And we're going to go in and we're going to disable their capacity through a precision strike. And so in that sense, I think Dobson is right, because he is showing that what Israel did was actually moral and right to do, even though many in the world community are condemning him. And notice condemning them. Notice this screenshot here. It's got the IDF's targets, and then it's got Iran's targets. I mean, who did the Israelis target in all of this? Military commanders, nuclear presence, air defense systems, surface-to-surface missiles, nuclear scientists, and then so Iran, once this happens, reacts, and who does Iran target? Homes, schools, civilians. I mean, look at how Iranian weapons now rain down on Israeli population centers like Tel Aviv. Now, many of these things the Israelis were able to knock down through their Iron Dome, which is kind of a Star Wars type of defense system. And they can thank the Reagan administration for that, for helping them with that technology. But the fact of the matter is, I was on the air with many people as this was happening in Israel, and they had to cut the interview short to go into the basement, to go into bunkers, to go into bomb shelters to go underground because these bombs were flying in at major population centers like Tel Aviv. So, what the liberal media does is they act like, well, both sides are bad. It's like kids in a sandbox fight at school, grade school. Hey, little Johnny, sit over here. Hey, little Freddie, you sit over there. And I want you to have time out and think about what you've done because both of you are wrong. Well, that's how the media is trying to portray what the Israelis did here. Folks, there's no moral equivalence at all. There's no moral equivalence between a precision strike to protect an Islamo Nazi regime from getting their hands on weapons of mass destruction versus Iran raining down rockets, bombs, etc. on Israeli population centers. The Israelis fight the most humane wars in human history, even, and it can be easily proven, dropping leaflets, to where they're going to target things so that innocent civilians, women, and children can get out of the way. And Hamas, in its wickedness, you know what it does? It hides in hospitals and orphanages and elementary schools because they know that the Israelis won't shoot at those targets. And if they do, they can make a big stink about it through their phony and fake statistics coming from the United Nations, etc. So this is the kind of tension that now exists between Israel and Iran. It's on full display. We believe that this is a precursor, not the final product, but a precursor of some kind to the tension that has to exist between Israel and Iran for the Gog-Magog scenario to unfold. Notice Ezekiel 37, verses 7 through 11. Ezekiel saw a lot of these things 2,600 years ago. He says, "So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied there was a noise, and behold a rattling, and the bones came together bone to bone. And I looked, and behold, sinews were on them, and flesh grew, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them." So this is speaking of this bone to bone, muscles and sinews, the nation of Israel coming back together in unbelief with no breath. The word for breath there in Hebrew is ruah. It's a reference to the Holy Spirit. This is the nation coming back together in unbelief first, before her national conversion in the events of the Great Tribulation period leading to the millennial kingdom. And so we're very special in the sense that we're living at a very unique time in history where we're seeing the body formed, the restoration of the nation of Israel, but her national conversion has not transpired. Verse 9 says, "And he said to me, prophesy as the breath, prophesy, son of man, and say to the breath, thus says the Lord God, come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe on these slain, and they came to life. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath came into them, and they came to life and stood on their feet." Now watch this, "an exceedingly great army. Then he said to me, son of man, these bones," here it is, we know what the bones are the whole house of Israel. "Behold, they say our bones are dried up, and our hope has perished, and we are completely cut off." You'll notice that I drew attention at the end of verse 10, I think it is, that when God restores Israel, and by the way, when God restores Israel, Ezekiel saw it as a noisy rattling. When God restores Israel in the last days in unbelief, in preparation for the end time scenario, it's going to be loud. It's going to be noisy. It's going to get the whole world's attention. That's exactly what we're seeing constantly in our headlines. The whole focus of the world now is aimed at the Middle East. And as God does this, he will turn Israel, end of verse 10, into an exceedingly great army. Not just an army, not just a great army, but an exceedingly great army. Now, I don't interpret that as the millennial kingdom, because you won't need an army in the millennial kingdom. The nations will beat their swords into plowshares, etc. I think this exceedingly great army is the army that will exist in unbelief just prior to God pouring out his breath, the Ruah, upon the nation of Israel in the events of the tribulation period. Why do I bring this to your attention in a prophecy update? Because the world right now is scratching its head. How did the Israelis have such military intelligence and military sophistication that they could execute, not just plan, but execute a military attack in Iran of such precision? How could they do it? I mean, her military capabilities, the world says, and her her military capacity must be the envy of the world. Now, why is that happening? I know why. Ezekiel 37 and verse 10 says it would happen just like that. As God would take Israel from the graveyards of the earth, recycle them in unbelief back into their own land, and they would have a great prowess in military conflict. And folks were living in the days of Ezekiel. Just a couple other things, if I could. It has to do with the cooperation between Russia and Iran. Ezekiel says it's Russia and Iran that will invade Israel in the end times. Now, if that is going to unfold, then the two regional powers, Russia and Iran, have to cooperate with each other. And that's what we see happening constantly. Here's something from the Iran Observer, June 9th. This is before the strike. 2025, it says, breaking, Russia gets heavily involved in Iran's nuclear program. Moscow will construct 8 nuclear power plants in Iran, 2 of which are already under construction. Several years ago, Russia was not even ready to sell Iran nuclear fuel. And even post-strike, notice this one. This one comes from the U.S. Homeland Security News. We have a screenshot of it there, June 16th, post-strike. You'll notice Vladimir Putin's picture there. It says, update, reports President Putin is considering sending Russian forces into Iran to save the Iranian regime from complete destruction. Iran is a major ally of Moscow. U.S. and Israel threatened to end the regime and possibly occupy the country. It looks like Putin, even post-strike, says not so fast, and he's rushing to Iran's defense. This is what Ezekiel said would happen. In the end times, Russia and Iran would develop an alliance with one another. Notice this particular article here. This one comes from the Jerusalem Post, June 6, 2025. This is very interesting because it involves China. It says Iran orders thousands of tons of ballistic missile ingredients from China. Sources estimate that if delivered, the materials could produce around 800 missiles. This is June 6, 2025, and this is pre-strike. And it's talking about an alliance not just between Iran and Russia, but Iran and China. In other words, Iran reached the level of a nuclear threat with the assistance of China and with the assistance of Iran. Now, Russia, let me rephrase that. Iran reached the level of a nuclear threat with the assistance of Russia. We've talked about that. And China. The China connection to me is also another sign of the times because I think China is destined to play a role in the end time scenario. Notice this graphic here of our tribulation period judgments, and we're speaking here of trumpet judgment number 6 and bowl judgment number 6. Here's what trumpet judgment number 6 says. Revelation chapter 9, I think we have a screenshot of this verse 14. Release the 4 angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. And then verse 16 says, the number of the armies was 200 million. I heard the number of them. So that's what's inaugurated with trumpet judgment number 6. And then you go to bowl judgment number 6, and you run into Revelation 16 and verse 12, which says, the 6th angel poured out his bowl on the great river, the Euphrates, and its water was dried up so that the way would be prepared for the kings of the east. You'll take a look here at this map, and we have the Euphrates River circled. The Euphrates River is that very important piece of geography that demarcates the remote east or the Far East or the Orient from the Middle East. And what I see happening in trumpet 6 is God summons an army of 200 million to leave the Orient and to head towards Israel. That's what's happening with trumpet 6. Bowl 6 is the end of the matter, where the Euphrates River is supernaturally dried up to prepare the way for the kings of the east to make their way into northern Israel for the final battle called the Battle of Armageddon. And I'm of the persuasion, along with many others, including the late scholar Dr. John Walvoord, that it's very, very probable that this giant army coming from the east, they're not demons. They're certainly demonically influenced, but they're not demons because the demons come out of the abyss in the 5th trumpet judgment. And these folks are riding on horses. I don't know if, demons ride on horses. They're coming from east of the Euphrates River. So it's a demonically energized human army moving into northern Israel. Trumpet 6, beginning of the process. Bowl 6, end of the process, to participate in this final battle called the Battle of Armageddon. Now, who is this giant army from the east? Well, notice this quote from the late Dr. John Walvoord, a critical and crucial scholar in his Revelation commentary. He writes this, just looking at the last sentence: the rising power of parts of the Orient in our day, in countries such as Japan, China, he says, and India, as well as lesser nations, make such an invasion a reasonable prediction. That becomes the significance of not just Russia, but also China helping Iran become a nuclear threat. See, it's not just the nations being in the right place to invade Israel, whether you're talking about Ezekiel 38 and 39 or the 6th trumpet and the 6th bowl. It's not just those nations in place that are hostile towards Israel. It is the fact that those very nations are cooperating with each other. Russia cooperating with Iran, China cooperating with Iran. So I bring these things to your attention in a prophecy update. That takes us to the end of our material for today. Looking at our review slide, we've looked at the work of the restrainer. In prophecy, we've looked at rising anti-Semitism, and we've looked at the forming Gog-MAGOG alignment and how the events that involve an Israeli strike against Iran and Iran's reaction against Israel are fitting into the identical pattern that God said they would be in just before the age of prophetic fulfillment and realization. And so we're privileged to be seeing these things develop. I hope you will join me in our next prophecy update, where we're going to go into a lot more material on global religion, the decline of the United States of America, and apostasy amongst America's churches, in addition to some information on growing Mark of the Beast technology. So we'll get into those subjects next week. Thanks for watching Pastor's Point of View. God bless you. I will see you next time.